What I'm going to take you through today is the overview of the requirements for certification by type on traces. Essentially, what I'm going to take you through, like Kevin said there, the two items that we will require, the traceability documents, are for the inputting of the information into the box I-25, which is the identification of the commodities box. You as an FBO user, it doesn't matter what part of the chain you are, whether you're a processing plant, cold store, logistical operator, this can be done by you. You just, when you're approaching the traces system, need to have the following information, both for yourselves as you're inputting, as I said, in I-25, and then also you will need to supply the details required that aren't immediately apparent on traces for the certifying body, the veterinary office, essentially. So we can break this down broadly into two main groups in terms of what information is required. The fresh minced meat health or expert health certificates. These are the health certs that apply to all of the bovine fresh mincemeat cert, ovine, porcine, poultry, and equine. Broadly, the requirements for those fresh meat certs are the same. So the information that is required to be inputted on the traces system for those species are, you can see it here on my screen. So you'll have to have the species, obviously. Now you'll have to have the nature of the commodity, the treatment type, the slaughterhouse, cutting plant, cold store, number of packages, net weight, and type of package. So for all species, you will be required to input the approval number for the slaughter plant from which that commodity has been derived, and the cutting plant and the cold store if they are applicable. All excluding poultry require that you input the nature of the commodity, which refers to whether it's a carcass, quartered, side, whole, and then also you can input whether it's minced or cut. The bovine, ovine, and porcine export health certificates require that you input the treatment type, which refers to whether the commodity is deboned, bone-in, matured, minced, and or frozen, and the date of freezing is required on certain EHCs, namely I believe it's the equine, the porcine, and I think possibly the ovine. But again, when you approach the traces system, that will become immediately apparent to you. But just in terms of, if again, traces is quite neutral in terms of who inputs this into the system. Anyone along the chain can have that information to hand, because essentially each row on traces should refer to a specific commodity type or a product type, and then the information that is input will have to refer to the producer. So if you're essentially creating the EHC on behalf of another producer, you input their information into that row that you see on screen now. I'll come back to that at a later date in terms of how to display that information, but essentially traces is quite neutral on who inputs that information. It's just that the veterinary office will have to have the traceability document that you used essentially to input that information so that they can then verify the details that you've input onto the traces system. So if there's multiple slaughter plants that are used, you can put them into that slaughter plant column, similarly for cutting plants and so on. So as I said, the veterinary body will require certain information with regard to those commodities outlined in I-25 that will enable them to verify the details that are included in that table. And the attachments box, that references box that you open up on traces, that is where you add those attachments so that the veterinary officer, the certifying body, can quite easily verify the information. Now, it's been mentioned previously at our webinars, a lot of that traceability information could be cleared beforehand. So ideally what you'd have is the full list of traceability information, but also a secondary sheet to your Excel workbook where you have a summary of that information, because most of the time all we will require is a summary, but we do need the capacity to verify it all. But just for workflow, a summary would be useful. And however, as I said, in addition to providing the supporting documentation as it pertains to the commodities in I-25, you will also need to include the supporting documentation required by the certifying body that enables them to complete part 2, which is certification of the expert health certificate. That will not be present to you on the traces system. You do not see that screen. If you wish to familiarize yourself with what is required externally to this presentation, I would highly recommend that you go to the DEFRA website and read the certs as they're present on the DEFRA website, as ultimately we're fulfilling their requirements. We have to match what they want. But for the fresh meat, the certification, the traceability documents that we require essentially is the same for them all. It's the country or countries of origin from of the animals from which the commodity or the product was derived. So you could have multiple raw material inputs from, say, pigs from Denmark, chicken from Thailand. You need to have all of that information on the EHC. All of that information available to the certifying body for the EHC. You also, for all of the fresh meat certs, require the dates of slaughter for the animals from which the commodity was derived. And as I said, if you're using a third country material, you will be required to provide the EHC or the CHED document that accompanied the import of that material. That is so that the veterinary officer, the certifying body, can verify all of the details regarding that third country material. So those are the informations that are required for the fresh meat certs. Then it's different for the meat preparations, the meat products, and the composite products export health certificates. We've grouped these together, but they are a little bit different depending on which cert is chosen at the outset, and I'll just go through that with you now. So I've taken these screenshots from the DEFRA sites or DEFRA certs that I mentioned. So Traces essentially has transposed the information from the DEFRA certificates onto the Traces website, but ultimately, like I said, we're trying to conform with what the UK import requirements are. So if you just read there, the meat preparation cert, it requires the species. So that's the scientific name of the species from which the product has been derived. The treatment type, again, it refers to the guidance note on what the treatment type is. I'll go in shortly. And you also require the approval number of the establishments, whether it be the manufacturing plant, the abattoir, the cold store, and you need the number of packages and net weights. Now, there's a slight wrinkle with the meat products. You'll see it there. Rather than the treatment type, it requires the nature of the commodity, the abattoir, the manufacturing plant, the cold store, and the type of packaging. And then composites, again, slight wrinkle. It doesn't require the abattoir or the plant of slaughter from which the animals were derived. It just requires the manufacturing plant. But in addition, the other two do not have this. You do need the production batch number for the composite product cert. And again, the certifying body will need traceability information that essentially the traceability information that you used to enter that batch number. They'll need to have that record or they'll need to have the capacity to check that information. So just note that for all of these fields, the certifying body will need the information that you used to insert the relevant approval numbers. But again, it does not matter who in the chain inserts those approval numbers, whether it's the processing plant, the cold store, the abattoir. Traces is quite neutral in that respect. But again, it's just that you will need that information so that you can proceed, so that you can input that into that system. And you also need to provide the supporting documents so the veterinary office can check the information. And then again, for the identification commodities box, the columns nature and treatment, what can be input on Traces on those rows is selectable from a drop-down list. So you don't need to know from scratch exactly what's needed. But if you wish to familiarize yourself with what those columns refer to, the options are taken from notes that are included on the DEFRA certificate. So what I have on screen here is just a note that's on the composite certificate, and it's with reference to what's input in the manufacturing plant row. So it's you insert the name and the approval number, if available, of the establishments of production of the composite products. And in the nature of the commodity in this instance refers to whether it contains meat products, treated stomachs, bladders, and intestines. So what you input there, it's on the Traces drop-down list as meat product, treated stomachs, bladders, or intestines. In the case of dairy products, it's just a dairy product that you collect from the drop-down list. And then for fishery products, you specify whether it's aquaculture or wild origin. Again, both of those options are available to you on Traces. So, as with the fresh meat certs, you will actually need to provide the certifying body information in addition to what you've put in to that identification of the commodities row. So the certifying body will require verifiable traceability information for the following. I've broken down by the certificate type. So for the meat preparations, it'll actually be quite apparent, but you will need to include the species and the origin of the animals. So you might have the approval code of the plant in the identification of the commodities row. However, in addition to the approval code for the plant, you will need the origin of the animals that were input for that product. For meat products, it's the species, the treatment, and the origin that are required. Again, the treatment is outlined in the guidance documents. It refers to, I think it's 2007-777. Michael might correct me in the question and answer portion on that, but that outlines the specific types of treatment that are applicable to a meat product cert. And then it's the composite product cert. If there's a meat product included in the composite product cert, then the information that is required for the meat product, the information that is required for the composite EHC is quite similar to the meat product EHC, but for the composite, you do need, in addition to the species, treatment, and origin, the list of approved establishments from which that material was derived. But again, that's information that should actually have input into I-25 identification of the commodities. And then for the dairy product composites and egg product composites, it's similar, where the requirements for those types of composite certificates are what's present in their respective non-composite certs. So if you want to familiarize yourself with the requirements for the dairy product composite or the egg product composite, read the regular dairy product cert or read the regular egg product cert, and the requirements are identical in the composite version of those certs. And again, just I'd like to reiterate, if third country material is used in any EHC, you will be required by the veterinary office, the certifying body, to provide the supporting documentation, which is the EHC or the CHED document that was generated and that accompany that import of that material. So what I'm going to talk about now, that is generally what you'll need in terms of the requirements by type. I'm just going to take you through some learnings that we've had from our certification trials that we've held with food businesses. And this is especially relevant for groupage scenarios where you could have multiple rows on your identification of the commodities box, and you could have multiple producers basically linking in that. Basically the EHC refers to a litany of producers. So a difficulty that we encountered was that it's actually quite hard on traces to understand and divine what a row pertains to what commodity. So as shown in I-25 previously, the FBO is able to input information related to the commodity, but it does not allow for the insertion of a product description that would enable the veterinary office to quickly identify what product is described and what traceability information refers to that row. I'll show you shortly a screenshot just so you can understand exactly what I'm talking about. But essentially, if you have 25 rows, all we'll see on traces is the information that was shown previously, which is the CN code, the species, and the slaughter plant. But we don't know, it says meat product, say for the mincemeat search, it'll say minced, but we won't know if that's a burger, if that's a burger patty, if that's minced meat. So essentially, we need you to devise a method that will relay that information to DAFM, because we will have to be able to essentially know what row is referring to what product. So below is a screenshot that's taken from traces that highlights this issue. It is for a hypothetical export health certificate where the commodities are sourced from multiple FBOs. So in this case, I'm a cold store. You can see here, I'm the cold store that has received product from multiple different producers. So you can see here my slaughterhouse and my cutting plants, there's a variety of different producers. I'm producing this EHC, but I cannot at a glance tell which refers to what. You can see there I have two rows that are identical. It's minced, but the slaughter code is different and the cutting plant code is different. So we will need you to have a method to relay that information to us. A suggestion I haven't included in my slide, but essentially if you're inputting rows like that, if you have 10, 15, 20 rows, it's quite possible you'll be using the CSV file upload feature. If you are doing that, what I'd recommend is saving that as an Excel file, so an XLX file, and adding 2 additional columns where you can just give us the name of the producer and the product description, and therefore we can match that up very quickly with the rows on traces so we know what we're certifying, because ultimately we do need to know what we're certifying. So just in that respect, make our lives easier, because that will make your life easier. But that is it from me. Thank you very much. And if you have any further questions, we'll be happy to take them in the question and answers portion. Back to you, Tony.